2018. Call the roll, please.
Commissioner Shaw?
Here.
Commissioner Ide?
Here.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Here.
Commissioner Mengelberg is absent this evening. Mayor Holliday?
Here. So we had an exec session, and we're going to have an additional exec session following the work session pursuant to ORS 192-662E to conduct deliberation with persons designated by the governing body to negotiate real property transactions. Does anybody have any future agenda items? Seeing none, we'll move on to the agenda. Discussion items 18-016, Oregon City street lighting. Mr. Lewis.
So Martin's put together a very interesting presentation for you on Oregon City street lighting, and I think Commissioner Ide, this was inspired from some feedback we heard from you about some questions about streetlights. So
from a citizen, Jay Pierce.
Yes. So that's kind of what started this effort, and so Martin, take it away.
Sure. So Martin Montalvo, Oregon City Public Works Operations Manager. I'm giving just a brief overview on our overall street lighting program. Majority of it's conducted by contract through PGE. The portions that we do control, there's about 850 light units that we control throughout the city. And what we've been doing to decrease city expenses and transition to a more efficient and less maintenance intensive lighting system. So I'll give you just a brief overview on what we're doing with that. So the first thing I'm going to go over is just our overall light inventory. So if you're wondering how many street lights we've got throughout the city, so the majority of the street lights within the city are either maintained or serviced by PGE in one way or another. And they're all controlled under one of three rate schedules. So rate schedule A means that it's owned by PGE, maintained by PGE, and we basically pay a flat fee plus a small markup for consumption for those 3,030 lights. So those LED cobra heads that you see running throughout the city, predominantly that is the inventory of streetlights that we have within the city. The majority of those are LED. We were the first city within the state of Oregon to do a full conversion. We completed that 5 years ago, so 2012, 2013. We've gotten a lot of great feedback once those were converted, and I hope you guys have seen a difference with the LED conversion. There are still a few high pressure sodiums, so for those that don't know, the LED is a white, crisp light, better definition and less harsh shadows. And then the HPS, or high pressure sodium, is a yellow light. A little bit more glow to it, a little bit of a warmer tone. The temperature is at about 3,000. The LEDs are at about 4,000, so that's how they characterize light color. The second largest quantity is, or the second one under PGE is rate schedule B. That means that it's a city-owned fixture, but PGE under contract is maintaining it and then providing all of the services to it. So if it gets struck for whatever reason and needs to be replaced, PGE's fixing it. They're sending us a bill for the replacement, whereas in Schedule A, something happens to it, PGE takes care of everything, and we see no change in our billing structure. The third entrance is what's called Schedule C, where it's city-owned and city-maintained. So these are lights. The best example are the acorn lights that we have throughout the city. Most of those are Schedule C. And what those are is we own them, we maintain them, something happens to it, our guys go out and fix it. If we want to do any conversions on it, we have to coordinate with PGE because they get billed at a flat rate. There's not a meter that's out there and measuring the actual consumption value. What it is they've got an industry standard for what that particular wattage should be consuming on a daily basis, how many hours per day, how many kilowatt hours is it being utilized, and we're going to bill you at said rate. There is no master meter. And then the other scenario is OC metered lights. So predominantly along the Malala corridor and the Main Street corridor, this is what we have in place down there. Those lights are city-owned, city-maintained. They're on a common circuit that feeds back to a meter that is actually read and serviced by PGE, and we basically pay the residential rate for consumption on that. So regardless of what happens to the light, it's not a flat rate, it's what you're actually consuming is what you're paying for, so there's no averaging. And those OC meter ones, those predominantly consist of the acorn type and the teardrop type. And I'll show you instances of each of those. With me this evening, I did bring our LED conversion that we've been going to with the acorn type, and I'll go a little bit more into that in just a few moments. So the cost structure for each of these is, it's a little convoluted, but I thought I'd give you just a brief overview, with the pretext being, let's talk about a common usage. So 150 kilowatt or 150 watt light. So whether it's on a cobrahead or whether it's on an acorn type, doesn't matter, but let's just envision if we had a 150 watt light and we were paying for that. So on a high pressure sodium 150 watt light, what you'd be paying to PGE on a monthly basis is about 9 cents a kilowatt hour, and then a flat rate of $5.30 a month per pole. Okay? The LED conversion that we've gone to, the consumption rate is still the same, or the consumption value is still the same, but the kilowatt hours has decreased drastically. That 150 watt light is now consuming, there are two conversions, one's a 48 and the other one's a 52 kilowatt predominantly, or watt. We're predominantly 52 watts, so we've cut the consumption rate down by a third, or down to two-thirds, sorry.
Two-thirds.
And then the pole charge is less as well. Why the pole charge is a little bit less, I'm not quite sure. I didn't get a good explanation from PGE, because theoretically they're the same poles that you have on a high pressure sodium as you would have on an LED. Option B, for those, again, city owns them, PGE's maintaining them. We've got the kilowatt hours, we've got the wheeling rate, that 9 cents a kilowatt hour, and then the pole charge for those is $2.80 a pole per month. Option C, it's a flat rate. It's about $2.30 per pole per month. And then there's the metered services, which is just whatever the residential rate is at that time. And that fluctuates based on what they get approved from the, for their rates that they can charge each year. So average, what does this cost us as a city overall? So for the entire street lighting circuit for all city properties, on both of the rate schedules that we fall under, we're spending about $24,000, $25,000 a month on electrical services. The largest electrical bills that we have are all associated with the street lighting circuit. Second largest electrical bill that we have is actually associated with the Mountain View pump station pumps to keep water flowing throughout the city. Metered service, so what we pay for everything that's not on the PGE flat rates is about $5,000 a month. So cumulatively, this information I got from Myrea, so what we paid in 2017 for calendar year 2017, all electrical circuits was almost $360,000. So anything that we can do to increase the efficiency and, for my guys, decrease the amount of maintenance that we have to do on these is an added plus for the city and gives us a little bit more latitude in what we have to do in terms of maintenance. So give you a little overview of what you can expect in terms of what the lights look like. This is an example of an LED cobrahead. So you've seen these throughout the city. The cobrahead gets its name just from that kind of overarching mast arm that the light head is actually mounted on. This is an LED. So you see that the light in this photo is a little bit whiter, a little bit crisper. If you see in the background in the photo on the right, that's a high pressure sodium town and country light. So this is out along Holcomb Boulevard, okay? So you can kind of see the difference in what you get in terms of lighting quality. In the foreground of the picture on the right, it's a little bit crisper, a little bit brighter. In the shadows aren't as harsh. In the background, you'll see the lighting that you get from the high pressure sodium. It's a little bit warmer of a tone, but it doesn't give you as good as definition for a commuting public, doesn't give you as good clarity when you're trying to drive through there. Yes, ma'am.
Quick question, is the light in the foreground, is that the whiter light, and the one in the background there, is that the more yellow?
Yeah.
Is it, okay.
Yeah. So the smaller one on the right-hand side, that's a high-pressure sodium, what we call a town and country light, okay? Similar to what we have along the promenade. The taller one, that's a cobrahead LED. It's a whiter light. It's about 4,000 degrees. The high-pressure sodium is about 3,000. So these are the teardrops that you see moving along Malala Avenue and up 7th Street. It's a large overhead light with a teardrop kind of hanging down a suspended mast arm. These are all high pressure sodium. We do not have a conversion for these to go to LED, and we own the majority of these. So these are either on Schedule C from PGE, so they're a flat rate, or they're behind a metered service and we're paying for that metered service. This is, I just mentioned the Early American Post high pressure sodium, or the Town and Country is another name for them. They look like the carriage style. We do have about 40 of these throughout the city. The best example is along the Promenade or along Holcomb. Moving up the hillside up along Holcomb, we've got these running through there. They're not a big inventory for these for us. This is the larger inventory of what we have on our lights. So this is an Acorn LED, and this is one of the recent conversions that we just finished out along Washington Street near the Abernathy Center. You can see from the light, it's a brighter white, a little bit more definition. I'll show you an example that conversion that we've just completed about a year ago that was predicated from requests from the police department for a little bit better lighting out there. So this is the high pressure sodium Acorn. And I'll show you a side-by-side between the two with the lights turned on to kind of give you an idea of what the difference is. It's a warmer tone. It doesn't give you as clear definition. The roadway, you can see even from this photo, isn't as bright as what you get from the LED conversion. Another reason for that, and I'll go into that when we go over why we chose this model for the LED conversions, is how the light is spread. So this is the staircase for the elevator. So Singer Hill staircase. Several years ago, the PD talked to us about, issues occurring on there over the evenings and trying to give better light clarity for people using the staircase in the evenings. This is a photo of the exact same light, exact same location, slightly different angle, so you don't get, it looks slightly different, but it gives you a good example of what you're getting once we went to the conversion. It's a brighter light. It's a clearer light. The actual energy consumption is significantly less, but the lumens that is being put out, I don't want to get too technical, is actually less lumens on the LED than you have from the high pressure sodium. So what that means is that high pressure sodium is working twice as hard to put out half as much light as the LED. All right, so why are we converting over to the LEDs? So one of the things we wanted to look at is a historic period appropriate conversion for the LEDs that would save us some money on the long term for maintenance and save us some money on the long term for consumption rates. So we looked at several different models and we chose to go with this Leotech conversion. And one of the things was every time one of these goes down, just the head alone, all right, there's a significant cost of $650 for switching over to the converted LED versus $1,200 for just getting back the old high pressure sodium. So you're not increasing efficiency, you're going back type for type, and you're paying twice as much. So that was a big thing for us. So then we said, well, we want to be energy conscious and we want to try and get to something that consumes less. So these LEDs, again, most of the high pressure sodiums that we have throughout the city are either 100 watt or 150 watt. These are 54 watt for the LED. So half or 2/3 of what we're consuming on the high pressure sodium lights. The high pressure sodiums have less light output. So the lumens that it actually produces are less than this produces. And when you convert that to kilowatts per lumens, it just means that this is almost twice as efficient as what you get from a high pressure sodium. Okay, I can get very technical on it. I don't want to, because frankly, I'll probably confuse myself, but I can just tell you efficiency wise, this is much more efficient. And one of the reasons, and I can show you, is on a traditional high pressure sodium light, you have the ballast that comes up, and Dan, you know this. So comes up from the bottom, and it basically shines light out through the globe. And then on the Acorn lights that we have right now, this is all glass here at the top. And what happens with that is a large portion of your light is lost because this is going up in the sky. So that doesn't lead to dark sky compliance, which isn't good for wildlife, and it's not good for anybody that wants to go out just stargazing or just sleeping next to one of these and not have it shine through your window. So one of the things that we looked at for the conversion is A, save money, but B, what other environmentally friendly aspects could we take a look at? So dark sky compliance was another one. With these LEDs, we went with this black cap that matches the same features as the posts that support these. The other thing, because of this black cap, the LEDs are mounted inside of it, pointing down and out. So we're pointing light out to what we want it at, on the streets and the sidewalks. It's not going up into the sky, not going up into the trees, much more efficient, much more directed light, and I can give you an example here in just a moment. The other thing that we liked about these is all of these LED conversions in terms of recyclability. This goes down for whatever reason and we have to dispose of it. 90% of the components of it are fully recyclable. For the high pressure sodiums, we don't have that component. So they're dark sky compliant, they're much more efficient, and they come with a 10-year warranty, which is what I love. Anything goes down, we call the manufacturer, he sends us a replacement before we even had to put this in the box and send it back to him. So we've had 2 of the conversions that have had an issue for whatever reason or another, and they've just sent over another one, and we've got it on hand, and then we send back the one that's needing repair, and they'll service it. So the manufacturer stands by the warranty, and we've seen that, and we've been pretty pleased with it.
Martin, I have a question for
Sure.
you. I come from a polymer background, plastic, that apparently is plastic, the way
Yep.
you're handling it. My 2 questions, does it have ultraviolet inhibitors on it? Do we have to worry about ultraviolet degradation? And do we have to worry about a yellowing of the lens and reduced light output over time?
So the light output possibly, I don't know for the LEDs from the light output, we shouldn't have any issues. The yellowing of the lens, the manufacturer has told us it should not be an issue, that we'd get about 20 years before these really start to degrade from any UV degradation. The proof is in the pudding. We'll wait to see how that works out. As far as everything above the lighting element, there's a metal shield inside of it that protects it past the LEDs. And then there's the refractive mirror up there. So we shouldn't have anything getting up and towards the top.
And to answer your question, LEDs don't degrade, output doesn't degrade over time. They either work or they don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question wasn't about the light. The question is about the filtration of the plastics.
Yeah, the acrylic that this is, yeah, they've told us we should get 20 years without any problem. And then the other thing with these, the temperature, the heat sink on these is significantly less than what we get from the high pressure sodium. So we're not going to have just temperature degradation from the actual lighting element itself.
Well, that's where you get the energy savings is because the high pressure sodium generates a lot of heat. So you're using a lot of electricity to produce heat.
Yeah, that's just being dissipated as heat.
Right.
That's useless. Yeah. So this isn't the exact same model as this. This is an example of one of the ones that we were looking at. This is the manufacturer, the Lumicon LRO F2. We chose the one that doesn't have the little struts in here because we didn't want it to be inconsistent with what we already have out. So light distribution, so most of our acorn posts are a 12-foot post. So you can get an idea of the light spread where we get on this. So we get about a 70 to, that average 70-foot spread from these going out, or I'm sorry, 70 to 86-foot distribution on these. So we do get some neighbors that have called saying this thing is so bright. Well, there's 2 reasons for that. The light spread is coming out, it's being directed, you're not losing a lot of energy going up into the sky. And the other thing is the temperature that I'd spoken about earlier. That whiteness, that 4,000 degree temperature, it's a little bit brighter, it's a little bit crisper, it's better for the driving public and for people using the sidewalk, so it just seems like it is brighter. But in the long term, it's a huge energy savings for the city, it's a huge safety improvement for the commuting public, and it's something that I think we want to keep moving towards. If they come out with a model that is burning at the 3,000 temperature, we may consider ordering a few of those. But for now, this is the standard that we've adopted and are moving with. So what are we looking at in terms of savings? So on an annual basis from the manufacturer's information, we haven't switched over an entire circuit. So I can't tell you this meter spent $2,000 last year, and this year it's only spent $1,000. So there are still hodgepodge throughout the city. The reason for that is I don't have a dedicated program for this. This was a maintenance initiative that we took, saying when one of these go down, we're switching them to LED. That's when we'll take advantage of it. That's the replacement program. In the long term, if we find that this is something that you guys want to proceed with, and we want to dedicate funds and do a programmatic approach, we can do that. But for now, we've had pretty good success with just, as we're having issues, we're switching it to an LED, and then 90% of the problems with it go away. To date, we've switched 64 of these over throughout the city in various locations.
And how many do you have total?
Over 3,000 lights, but how many of them are Acorn, I still haven't gotten to the bottom of. We've just finished a pretty big project with our GIS group and PGE, clarifying some of the data because we've had some conflicting information, and within the next 60 days, we should have a good final number for everything. So that $26 savings that we should be expecting on an annual basis, for each light, when you convert it over to the possible quantity that we have, we're looking at somewhere about $1,500 a year in savings, which isn't insignificant. So, and then we've also reduced our maintenance costs significantly because I've got a 10-year warranted light.
So knowing you, you've probably done a payback period on this already.
The ROI? I can't complete it until I have a full head count of how many of these we have. So Chris has been working with PGE and working with our streets division, finishing the inventory and cleaning up the data because we didn't have very good data. We're about 90% done with that project. We had a meeting with PGE last week and went over their data, our data, showed them some of the things that we found. And then now we're out ground truthing the errors that came up. Two things will come of that. We'll have a good inventory, but I'm also having them correct a lot of our fee schedules. We found several lights that were being billed for that aren't city lights. They're floodlights for a private property. I'm having them converted over and switched over to somebody's private meter. I'm having several lights that no longer exist that we are still getting billed for, taken off, and then see what can be done in terms of refunds. So we'll finish that up probably in the next 90 days. John's been involved with it, but it's a good project.
So at some point, will this commission be asked to make a decision to replace upon failure or to take a large-scale project and based on your ROI?
Yeah, I don't foresee us looking for a large-scale project. We've had pretty good, just using it as a maintenance program.
Okay.
So, plus, then I'm not diverting funds from something else. I think with our guys, the way that we've done it is, this is the initiative, and as they fail, make the transition. It'll take longer to do a full conversion, but the plus side is I'm not robbing Peter to pay Paul. There are other projects that are higher priority, frankly.
Well, and you're not taking out working lights that still have
Exactly.
life.
Yeah. Ma'am.
Can you go back to the first slide, I think it was, where you had the number of PGE lights and,
The 3,030.
yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, so what lights are down in the McLaughlin neighborhood, like about Washington and 15th?
Okay, those are the Acorn lights.
Okay,
Okay, some of them are LED. Most of them are still high pressure sodium. And they are, I still don't know, and this is where I'm cleaning up the data. I don't know if they're OC metered, so they're all behind a common meter, or whether they're just on Schedule C. So it's a flat rate that PGE charges us. So that's what Chris and our streets division have been working on, is we need to get all of this billing information clarified.
the complaint that I received from the neighborhood was that they're too bright, of course, and that bulbs were not appropriate for the historic type of lamp post.
So that is the bulb that you received the complaint on.
Okay.
Okay. That is the area that you received the
Yeah.
complaint on. This is also that same area. So city code, under city code, it says that what's governed under the historic overlay is they have to be the black wrought iron style post, okay? And that the globe should be this type of acorn type globe. City code does not speak to the actual tone or temperature of the light, nor does it speak to the mechanism for producing light, so the ballast and the other lighting elements. It simply says the pole is supposed to be a black wrought iron pole with an acorn type light. So we're meeting city code. What we're trying to do is be a little bit better stewards of tax dollars and get something a little bit more efficient, and for us, less labor intensive that we can focus on other things.
So the previous slide showed, didn't have that black top on
Yep.
it. So as far as like the light just going out into the sky, are those eventually going to be replaced with these?
That's the goal
Yeah.
as they go down or require extensive maintenance. So if the maintenance is minor, we're not switching it over.
Yeah,
If
okay.
the maintenance is major, then it's getting converted.
Okay. And are those really antique light posts themselves?
No,
or,
no.
Okay, so I didn't think so, but I just wanted to ask.
Antique
So they
circa
could be easily
15 to
replaced
17 years,
or
maybe.
Replaced. They could be replaced if it was damaged?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they get, and Jim can attest, they get replaced frequently because they get hit often.
I remember we used to.
Sometimes with police cars.
Yeah.
So a question for the benefit of the historical area, if they do prefer a softer light, is there an additive to that? Is there some kind of additional filter that can enjoy the benefits of energy efficiency plus softer light?
For the instance that you're referring to, what we were able to do is talk to the manufacturer, and we replaced that light with one that has an element in it that shields some of the light from going back towards that homeowner's home. That's what we have right now, is being able to block some of the light, obstruct it. That's what we implemented in that instance. In terms to somebody saying it's too bright or it's too white, until the manufacturers come out with something that's burning more in the 3,000 range, that's a little bit softer, we're not there yet. So the best equivalent that I can give you is, if you're looking at lights for your home, what the neighborhood wants is like a soft white, okay? What this is this is a bright white.
Whatever light the
not all
bulb
the
itself produces,
Yeah.
whatever light the bulb itself produces, I mean, it still gets filtered through that
Yeah.
lens.
And the globe still gives you that architectural feel.
Well, that was my question. Is there like, to use not a good example, is there?
Oh, like
an amber lens or
a
something?
globe that's yellowed automatically? I haven't seen anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Any
I mean, the
questions?
operational costs are 6 times for the current light versus that one, if I look at those ratios correctly.
Yeah, it's
Not
pretty,
counting maintenance and repair.
just energy costs is 3
Yeah.
times. Yep. Okay.
I don't have any more questions on that, but I do have a comment.
Sure.
The city commission has received well over 120 email in the last, 6 months or so from the Audubon Society. There's the Portland Audubon's Light Out campaign has been going on for some time, and of course, they're encouraging they have all kinds of suggestions on what, in property owners and, cities and whoever can ideas of things to do to keep the lights down and to use the black tops. And anyway, I just for the record, I'd like to put into the record this email, because they were all identical emails. And it just explains their purposes and, for nature, for environmental issues and so forth. So I'd like to just turn that in. We keep getting them.
No problem. We're trying to get there. That's one of the components that we look for
turned them off.
with the selection.
Oh, well, that's fine.
Well, I think everybody understands that, but there's always trade-offs. What's your priority? Is public safety your priority?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, do we
public
tailor it?
safety and good stewardship of public dollars. so
Certainly.
Trying to save some money for everybody.
So maybe we make adjustments depending on area of use.
All right. If there are any other questions, I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good presentation as always, Martin. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Leave this in your office. I'll get it tomorrow.
Okay, moving on. Item 3B, 18-013, Park Separation Facility, Mr. Phil Lewis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor and Commissioners. I'm here today. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, as this is information that you've seen before. But to give a quick recap, our Park Ops facility was red tagged in 2013. Our staff are currently using a mobile rental unit, which they've been using for the last 4 years. At the April 11th Commission work session, we presented a conceptual plan to replace the facility, the current facility, with a somewhat like footprint facility. During that meeting, Commission directed staff to bring back additional concepts that showed a 1/2, 1/3 again, more space with a long-term view of the property. At the October 11th work session, we did present conceptual plans for a larger facility footprint. Commission at that meeting identified option B as their preferred conceptual plan. The preferred conceptual plan and slightly larger footprint brought the phase one construction as identified to $1.3 million. As a commission goal for the 2017 to 19 budget biennium, commission allocated $650,000 to be used for the replacement shop facility. This obviously leaves us a gap in funding. After that October 11th meeting, staff evaluated our current budget and tried to find areas within our current allocation where we might be able to reallocate funds to be able to use towards the park operations facility. With that, we found some deferred maintenance funds that might be able to be shifted over, as well as some general operating funds from other areas that could be shifted over. This obviously would be a decision to prioritize certain areas over the other. Our deferred maintenance budget currently for this biennium is identified to do a lot of asphalt replacement projects for pathways, as well as a restroom replacement project at Chapin Park. The Chapin Park restroom project would not be affected by this reallocation, but we would see substantial adjustments to our asphalt replacement plan for our deferred maintenance program. With the identified funds, about $300,000 would be able to be shifted. That would still leave us with a $350,000 gap in providing the facility as identified by commission. Staff did go to the most recent Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee meeting to present a proposal, which would be to use system development charges, park system development charges, to fill that gap, the $350,000. It is an SDC eligible project, and staff believe that there's enough funding in there to appropriately provide for current goals of the commission and of the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee, as well as providing the appropriate facility needs for the park operations facility. Some of those identified goals of PRAC and of staff are to develop the Glen Oak Park property, which is identified within this current biennium, as well as the Filbert Run property. We have about $4.5 million in our Parks SDC fund, of which roughly $2 million would go into the Glen Oak Park property and roughly $1 million into Filbert Run, which would leave us about $1.5 million as a reserve in our SDC budget if all of those funds were expended during this time period. So PRAC did vote by motion at the December meeting 6-0. With one abstaining, a recommendation to the City Commission that SDCs should not be used for the facility and that the city should dedicate other funds to build the park operations facility. So this, we've identified the plan for the park operations facility. We do have a identified way to pay for it, but it is not supported by the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee. And so my request to the commission is to help us in identifying a way to provide the appropriate facilities for staff and find a resource in order to make that happen.
What was the reasoning given by PRAC to not utilize Parks SDCs for the park maintenance facility?
It's a good question. The main point of PRAC during the conversation stemmed around our lack of park space in areas of the city, not being equitable in the distribution of parklands, and wanting to land bank, as we're a rapidly developing city, wanting to land bank park areas to be able to provide at some point park space for those residents.
Questions?
Well, I've read it in detail, and I wouldn't be prepared to make a decision tonight, because if you look at the progressive plan, do it in stages, there's a lot of questions about how to most effectively accomplish that. And I also note that our $350,000 shortfall, as you notice, that happens to be the exact same figure that's in there for a 15% contingency. $350,000, I believe, when you look at the spreadsheet on it. So I'm more sympathetic to the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee position. I really want to see the quality of our parks increased. My goal is always deliverables to our community. When I haven't lost sight of what you need for an operational facility, but I'd like to review it in more detail, maybe at a separate meeting where I sat down or we sat down with staff, realizing I'm not a sole decision maker. Thank you.
Thank you. I would point out that the contingency for phase one as identified is listed at $111,000. We do have additional funds which are not included in the LRS memo, which would be for soft costs. Obviously, we would hope that we would come in under budget, and we're planning for worst case scenario with appropriate contingencies and soft costs built in.
Would you summarize the contingencies for all three phases of the project then, since you stated the first one was only 111?
Correct. So
The second being 59.4, the third being 153,750.
yes. So all of the budget figures and build out that we're discussing tonight is just in relation to the phase one development. The overall cost for fully developing the property in a phased approach would be closer to the $3 million figure, which we obviously would not be able to accomplish within our current budget biennium.
So, I think we all love our HRB and appreciate all the work they do.
You mean PRAC?
And PRAC. Probably an HRB person out there, but yeah, PRAC, excuse me. And I guess I was a little interested into seeing how they came to their decision there. And I think after talking that I can understand it. Do we know how much SDC fees we are generating each year for parks?
We have around $600,000 as an estimate. Obviously,
I mean, each year though, do we?
Per year.
Per year we get about
So-
600,000.
Yeah, so during the budget biennium, 1.2 million should be coming in. And that, again, that's an estimate and it's built around our construction.
So we're asking for 350,000
Correct.
and we're generating 600,000 a year.
Correct.
Okay. So that to me, and to me, this is an embarrassment, the building condition we have right now. And I'm also looking at employee retention, that these folks have to go down and work in that John Storm restroom area down there, and knowing what they're going through with the folks that are using that facility down there, and then they have to come up and get cleaned up, and what we're putting our employees through, and then they have to come up and work in this facility that we have red tagged, or the trailer outside whose septic system froze up again here recently, I think. So we have some quality employees here, and I want to keep them, and I think we need to give them a facility that is presentable for them. And like I say, we love PRAC, and I hate overriding anything they do. But in this case here, when we're looking at, again, we're getting 600,000 a year rolling in here, and we're asking for 350,000 to cover the gap here. And I don't have an issue with phase one here, so by doing that.
How do we cover our yearly maintenance and repair costs, our upkeep on our parks? What's the source of those funds?
Primarily through general fund support.
And do we have any safety issues that this would address? And do you currently have any employee retention problems?
We do have employee retention problems. We've hired 2 new staff within the last 6 months. The majority of our park staff have been hired within the last 2 years.
And those are replacement staffers?
Correct.
Rather than additional?
Correct.
And do your exit interviews indicate they leave because? You may not know.
Yeah, I was gonna say many times it's for, personal reasons. I will say we do have to cycle through job duties based on the work that they're doing out in the field. And the type of work is, as Commissioner Shaw identified, at some of our facilities, which definitely does not add to the quality of work that they would like to see happen in our parks. Our most recent staff person that left did note that that was the selling point, was the not having to worry about those types of things. I don't know that that's necessarily tied to the facility. I do know that the not having appropriate restrooms to use, especially in the winter when it's wet and cold and freezing, to not have an appropriate restroom facility to use in their shop space is something that does drag morale down. But additionally, having inefficiencies with equipment stored all over the city, having to pick up their equipment at one site, their truck at another site, this will solve many problems for our park staff, including morale.
Good ride.
Is there any way that we can borrow from the 350 from the SDCs and then in this biennium and then pay them back in the next so that the SDCs are not lost? I want to respect
on the budget implications of that.
Thank you, Mayor Holliday and Commissioner Hyde. It's a good idea. I mean, essentially you have to pay it back. So there are Oregon Revised Statutes of limitations on the payback period, which would be a 10-year period. You could do that, but essentially it's like you're going to spend the money. And so the payback period, to be straightforward, I think the answer is no, because it's, the cash is the cash and you're going to have to pay it back. You can extend the period for sure. I do understand.
Let me toss out another idea. How much do we have banked for the other Mr. Lewis's facility? Is it somewhere around $8 or $9 million?
Possibly $11 million, Mayor. I'm not enamored with that idea.
And
There's reasons that we set aside those funds separately. If you consider what the issues that Portland got into with funding their general fund.
no, what I'm saying is
water fund, it wasn't good.
Could we not borrow the 350 from that fund and pay it back from Parks and Rec over a time period?
Yeah, I appreciate the creativeness, but I think, isn't there a term borrowing from Peter to pay Paul or something like that? I think that applies, absolutely.
Actually, I think that would be a proper approach because one of the arguments to improve the current facility is not to have to get support from the second Mr. Lewis's facility, either storage or maintenance and repair. So it seems like we lift a burden from that facility by constructing this facility.
I would also say as a practical standpoint in terms of financial stewardship, an awareness that if there's a choice to use a restricted money for a project versus an operations money, you should always choose to use the restricted money because you can always make a separate determination on the operation at a later time. And I think that's the case here. In this case, City Manager could talk about this further, but we looked specifically at, if you recall, we put together the budget with no increases in fees and to meet the commission goals. And we strategically did that, and by we, I mean you, and we designated a specific ending fund balance in the general fund, which is about $2.7 million, which represents 12% of our operating costs. And our goal ultimately is 16% of operating costs. And I expect that there'll be some give back with the budget that will probably fill that gap to get to the 16%. But I just would, respectfully recall that we put together a pretty lean budget to meet specific goals related to Willamette Falls Legacy Project, relocation community development, this parks project, and those are all in the budget. And I think if we get a little bit sideways on that, I just couldn't advise it that, because we would be eating into funds that we're about to issue police bonds, and credit rating is highly based on your ending fund balance. And so I think it's important for us to consider that and kind of stick to the game plan. I think Mr. Lewis also stated that we have sufficient system development charges set aside to accomplish two of the major projects, or the two major projects that we focused, plus some additional funding. So I'd be surprised that we would want to use operations money that we pretty much desperately need and have committed as a commission, as a staff, to parks operations and deferred maintenance, and take additional of those funds when we have the SDCs available and in excess.
I guess I'd, just to piggyback on that a little bit, when we're asking for, we've put together $950,000 in general fund money that'll go to this building. The request was to add additional square footage to the building to accommodate future growth, should we need that. It is exactly what SDCs should be spent for, is accommodating future growth. And the difficulty is, we obviously struggle with deferred maintenance. We struggle with staffing levels. We have a building that's been red tagged for 4 years, of which we're trying to build large enough to accommodate future growth. In going back to what Mr. Parno was saying, the $350,000 from the SDCs is a restricted fund. It can only be used for improvements, construction related to accommodating future growth. The more we take from the general fund, which gives us much more flexibility in how we allocate those funds, is just less that we have in the future. It does concern us to fully fund with general fund a building that we're constructing for future growth. We're not asking for $950,000 in SDCs and going short on general funds. I think we've really tried to stretch this to use general fund as far as we could. And I think it comes down to a prioritization, but I do appreciate wanting to be proactive, which we probably haven't done a very good job of historically in buying parkland. But if I don't have a safe place to put employees to even address existing parkland, I'm not sure how we address more parkland.
I appreciate those thoughts, but the question I have, the timing of the project. So if you were to get it started very soon, is there any way, what would be the approximate start and the end of the project? And would we be able to use the $950 from this budget and then in the next biennium schedule funds to finish the project? I don't know, I'm just trying to be creative.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Holliday and Commissioner. I really appreciate that creativity, and I think you're right in thinking in that way. However, in addition, one of the things that we have is projections into the future beyond this budget. And, we've talked about in the past a little bit some of the upcoming things that we're expecting in addressing these project costs here that we have, plus some things in the future horizon, the next 2 budget cycles. So we have pretty well dialed in where we think general funds will be. I guess the most creative thing that I could say, another way to look at it, but similar to what you're saying, is that if we, at any time, the commission could look in a subsequent budget period or even through a supplemental budget process and say, wow, look at this great piece of land that we want to buy. What are the resources we can do? And at that time, they could say, well, we want to use some of this general fund money and this money and buy that land. So that could occur. That flexibility is there with general fund resources. You'd have to weigh that against the operations. But what happens if you use SDC money, you don't have that flexibility. So we already know, because the commission pointed out in our last goal setting process, that there was a good desire to focus some money on parks operations, deferred maintenance, and facility, and we definitely did that. My concern would be that if we at this time use operations money to pay for that project, and we also know that that's programmed over several years, if we do that, we're restricting ourselves. But I wouldn't want the commission or PRAC to ever feel like if there's a need to go in and focus, if we find the ideal piece of property, we can always use unrestricted money. It's just that we can't later on get back the restricted money that we used. Is that a little bit helpful? So I would always vote for using the most restricted funds. Yeah, I would always advocate for using the most restricted funds for the project at hand. In this case, it is the purpose of those funds is for growth related, which the commission requested. But I wouldn't say that the commission is limited in the next budget cycle for saying we want to reallocate some resources from the general fund.
So I think it's key to remember that we just spent a bunch of money to buy extra acreage up there so that we could expand the size of the building for that 50-year time frame that we're talking about. The $350,000 in parks SDCs is not it's not a gigantic amount of money. It's, just a little bit more than half of what our annual, revenue is. And to be honest, I think as we look at the building situation going forward the next probably, 5 to 10 years, I don't see that decreasing. I see it increasing as we build out more subdivisions in Oregon City. So I have to go with the recommendations of the finance director and city manager that we take this money out of that and get that building built so we've got employees in a safe and clean environment to be able to work and store equipment and be efficient. I appreciate the Parks and Rec Advisory Committee and the work that they do, but the final policy body is here. And as we've learned in the recent past, sometimes we have to make decisions that are not the same as the advisory committees that are below us. So that's where I'm at.
So, Mayor Holliday, one thing we've also, it's also included in this package is the new restrooms for the public.
Right.
And that's also something very public for us that, needs to be replaced and fixed. And so this is a real public project here we're talking about here, so.
And to Commissioner Hyde's question earlier, we anticipate that we would try to hit the ground running as quickly as possible as far as construction schedule. I would imagine probably, within 18 months being able to complete the project.
Okay. Did PRAC have any other suggestions for potentially finding another $350K?
They did request that the city look at updating park SDCs, was one of their other requests going through the process. The $350,000, their suggestion was to look at reserves to not impact, one, our operating costs, or two, our ability to use SDCs in the future for land acquisition, land banking. But as Wyatt pointed out, if it is the vision of the commission to identify properties for purchase at a later date, we could do so through a goal-setting process.
Thank you.
Any further questions, discussion? So do we have, why don't you put this item on the agenda for the 17th?
Okay.
Make it a 5-minute discussion. That way we can make a decision. Okay, so.
Thank you very much.
Moving on. Last item for tonight, PC 18-002, proposed amendments to development sections of the Oregon City Municipal Code, including lot averaging. Ms. Turway.
Thank you very much. So on December 12th, we had a work session where we talked about lot averaging. Lot averaging, as you recall, was an issue that came up quite a bit at the end of 2017. It is where when you have a subdivision, within that subdivision, some of the lots can be below the zoning minimum. So for example, if the subdivision is in a 10,000 square foot minimum zoning designation, you could have 8,000 square foot lots, provided the subdivision as a whole averaged 10,000 square foot lots. And so that was on December 12th. Since that time, a lot has happened. On December 18th or so, we sent out public notifications to all the property owners within the urban growth boundary, more than 11,000 of them. And the purpose of those public notifications, we call them Measure 56 notices, is to tell people that we're doing things that could potentially affect their property value, and to let them know what we're doing and give them an opportunity to participate. The purpose of that card was originally for alternate mobility targets, and we thought, hey, since we're already noticing everybody in the urban growth boundary, let's do some code changes. And since we had been talking about lot averaging and making amendments to those code changes, I could get this process kick-started for you before I come back to you with the amended language, which is what I'm here to do today. So we noticed the public, and we're going through a series of public notices. We'll talk about that a little bit more. We met with our development stakeholders group, which is a body that we hold once a week up in community development. And that includes the chair of our CIC, as well as members of our development community, to take a look at all of these code changes So the code changes, the big one is lot averaging, and then there's everything else. The everything else are pretty quick and easy amendments. Since this process was very quick, and we're also going through the equitable housing project right now, we just thought, hey, if we have quick amendments where we could streamline our code, get rid of any places where our code is clunky, or we can clarify where there are common misconceptions or things like that, let's do that right now. And then we'll include lot averaging in it, so that process is already going, and the public is aware of it before we make any changes. So the purpose of this meeting today is to talk about those changes, again, lot averaging and then the kind of everything else, and then give me your opinions and any guidance on this code language. Are they good? Are they bad? Should I delete them, or should we tweak them in any particular way? So feel free to interrupt at any time with comments or questions or whatever your thoughts are. Again, we've noticed them last month. We've met with our development stakeholders group. We are meeting with this CIC, or the Citizen Involvement Committee, in February, on the first Monday of February, and we're also having an open house and a work session with Planning Commission in a couple weeks on January 22nd. So this is all evolving very fast. So that is the process for this. We'll talk a little bit later, after we talk about the content of lot averaging, about how you want us to handle the process of lot averaging. Meaning, should it stay in this process that we've already identified with all these other code changes, or should we treat it in some other way? So for the lot averaging, what we did is we listened to your comments that the code needs to be changed. Again, right now, it just says as long as the lots average the minimum zoning designation, you can have lots that are up to 20% less than the zoning designation. There are no limitations on how many can be below the zoning designation, and that has been voiced to the commission as an issue this year. And so what I had proposed is to make some minor tweaks. And I was hoping that these tweaks together can create a package that gets to the intent of what you were intending. Also, in the work session on December 12th, we talked about utility lines and you know, should we not restrict these lots when they're adjacent to other properties? And we talked about lots of potential solutions to address this problem. And I was trying to find a solution that is clear and objective. So a solution where the public can read the code and understand what can be applied, as well as developers and staff, and that is feasible. Some of the concerns that we had regarding limiting lot sizes adjacent to other properties are, if this was intended to be utilized towards infill, a lot of this couldn't be utilized at all then. So there are a lot of lots that are adjacent to other properties that may need to be reduced, and the overall effectiveness of this tool is decreased significantly. I would say that at the development stakeholders group, we heard a unified feedback from all the parties, which again, remember, included a chair of a CIC and the development community, saying that these proposed code amendments are too restrictive. So they felt that what we had proposed was too much, and that they needed more time to sort of think about this and the ramifications of these a little bit more. That being said, here's what we have proposed. Rather than allow the lots to be reduced 20% below the zoning designation, so from these R10 lots going to 8,000 square feet, they could only go to 9,000 square feet, so only 10% below. And those lots that are below the zoning minimum, only 25% of the lots in a subdivision can use that tool. And so what we heard, again, from the development stakeholders group was that combination was a problem. And what was more specifically a problem was that reduction from 20% to 10%. So allowing lots to go smaller was better than for the development community than restricting the percentages of lots. If we only want 25% of the lots to be small, that's fine. The real problem with development is that when you limit the size and you're trying to build in constrained areas, you only have so much space and only so many lots can fit in that space. I'm going to show you some examples out of our development stakeholders group. We obviously had a lot of concerned developers, and so one of them had run through a recent subdivision that they had applied for and been approved for through the old version of our code and then the new draft version of our code, and we could talk about the result of that as well. The one thing I want to highlight that we talked about last time is if you're in R10 zoning designation, you have to average 10,000 square feet per lot. You only get so many lots. Lot averaging does not help you get more lots. It helps you get closer to the lots that the zoning designation allows. In other words, you don't lose lots. You don't gain any lots. If you have a certain amount of space and you divide your space by 10,000 square feet, and that's your average, you only get that number. You'll never get more by lot averaging, because you'll always have to accommodate for all the area. So I think.
But Laura, I'm going to interrupt you, but on the flip side of that, if you don't lot average, you will get less lots, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you'll be.
'Cause I know we make that statement all the time about
if you
density.
could, yeah, if you could take your land, divide it by 10,000 square foot lots and get 10 lots, lot averaging maybe helps you get 9 lots. Without lot averaging, you may only get 6 or 5 or 7 or something.
That's a good
So it helps you get closer to 10, which is what the zoning allows. So in other words, it helps you balance all these restrictions. When you have restrictions to put streets in, and sometimes they build around existing houses, and there are different physical constraints that make only this size space feasible, and that's where lot averaging comes in, is you're working in physically constrained areas.
I think it's the difference between the density allowed on the property versus a lot layout, right? So that even under the existing code, if it allowed 10 lots mathematically, lot averaging used to the maximum would never get you to 11. Right. So you're correct in your differentiation between the density and the actual number built.
And so here's an example, which is the Lindsay Ann 2 subdivision. Excuse me. And so the developer was kind enough to run through some scenarios of what it looks like with the proposed code and the existing code. Here's the layout as it stands. You can see it has 28 lots. Under the proposed code, it loses 5 lots, and it's only 23 lots. And that's with the proposed code of saying you can only be 10% smaller, and you have that limit restriction to only 25% of the lots. The areas highlighted in orange are the places where each one of those blocks has lost a lot. And I'm going to flip back and forth, and you can kind of see the difference. So, for example, up here, it's 2, and then you go back and it's 1, right at the top corner. Here, it's 2, you go back, back, and it's 3. So in each one of these places where there's a box, if you get rid of that 20% reduction, you're losing a lot. Thus, the overall picture of losing 5 lots. So kind of flip back and forth is a little bit easier.
And by name, what is this, an R6 subdivision?
This is an R6 subdivision, that's correct.
Okay.
So it sounded like the consensus from developers were, if we want to limit this to a percentage of the subdivision, that's fine. The thing that is making this tool unuseful is that we're going from the 20% reduction to a 10% reduction. In other words, that's help us get closer to the density that the zoning designation already allows.
What would this look like with, does the second one meet the 25% rule?
They say it does.
Okay.
So yeah, this is meeting the 25% rule. You'll see that all of them are all a little bit more because in each of those blocks they got some more square footage.
Get it small enough.
So is the reason that if you had that 100,000 square foot property, I can't even phrase my question. I just need to sit down with you at another time and go over this because
Yeah.
it isn't making sense in my non-technical mind.
Yeah, I think the challenge is balancing that you have to have a lot size, a lot width, a lot depth. You have these streets you have to build between. I think
It was the right of way that I was having to.
this block
It
up
takes
top,
into consideration.
this is the perfect example of why we wrote this code, and particularly why we wrote it for infill, is like, these roads are going through, and we want to prioritize our transportation system and roadways. And so knowing that we have all these physical constraints because we want roadways and we don't want to, we want a connected street system when we move forward with development, we know that something's got to give. And here, there is however many lots there are there, but if you were to allow the lot averaging to utilize lots that are less than 20%, then you get one more. The lot size, the configuration changes a bit, but your overall result is one more lot, because having to meet lot size and frontage and width and depth, putting all these layers of restrictions on top of each other in these constrained spaces means something falls out, and it's usually extra lots.
I'm going to ask a question that may supplement Commissioner Ide's question. On the supplementary literature you gave, the 1612-050 calculation or lot reductions, we had this discussion before about what is calculated, what is allowed to be used to downsize another lot. For example, it says the average lot size area is determined by calculating the total site area devoted to dwelling units and dividing that figure by the proposed number of dwelling lots. So what we've seen is on right-of-ways that don't allow you to place a dwelling unit under it, saying in R10, the developer will take an acre that's now a right-of-way that he can't use for dwelling, and he'll attach it to another lot. We'll have a 50,000 square foot single lot, at which time we have 20 2,000 square foot adjustments possible on other lots. Do you follow that?
I do. I think that's the crux of this problem, is it's a little complicated, and there's 20 different ways to get to your end result, which I assume the end result is what we had proposed in the language was cap the number of lots that can go below the zoning minimum. And you can talk about things like that to get at it, but I wanted to do it in a way that was very clear and transparent for everybody. So I hope that I've hit the overall result, although I hear it's quite restrictive. But yeah, we can start to talk about what land you do count, what land you don't count. In this picture, to explain, we don't count tract A because you can't put a house there, so it's not considered. We do count.
Which was tract A, Laura?
It's a stormwater facility on that bottom.
This right-of-way, this diagonal?
We don't count right-of-way, but we do count a lot. And we have, right here, we have this funky lot number 23 and lot.
Right.
We
So
do include the PG.
We've got 45% of that lot that we're including with unbuildable land that we can now calculate in the lot averaging. If you look at that diagonal that cuts through there, we've added that amount of area to lot averaging.
It is on someone's yard, and they can place a house on that property, so it is included in the calculation for lot averaging. Again, though, it doesn't get a more density.
Well, I don't argue with that. That's just a.
But part of the point is, Frank, that that's not buildable land, so they could, if they were able to utilize that for lots, they could probably get another 6 lots on that section.
No argument.
So, by the averaging, that allows them to get closer to what they should be able to build in that zone.
Well, I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to, I think the ordinance was originally passed to work with builders, to recognize that sometimes the topography doesn't allow you to get your 8 or 10,000 or your R8, whatever it is, lot every time, that we should have some flexibility in it. And I think it's just recent occurrences where we end up with 80% being less than the R designation. And I think, again, I'm here to work with builders and also maintain our quality. I know they've said about cookie cutter houses. I'm not looking for every house to be on a 10,000 square foot lot. In fact, I think there's a certain beauty to a development that has some 10s, some 8s, some 6s. I mean, it gives you that variety. But I think we need to be careful on how we define this and how we make the calculation. And we discussed in the previous thing, do we include these areas that were otherwise unbuildable in lot averaging? And I think that needs to be a detailed discussion.
We did look into that quite a bit. One of the biggest concerns we ran into was that when we start to exclude land related to easements, is that it changes. So we put public utility easements around the edge of properties, which generally setback area, and they can tweak a little bit after subdivision plat. When they go to finalize the thing, it's not certain up front. So, and otherwise, the goalpost is kind of changing because easement areas always change. And so it seemed like a hard way to answer the question. And so what we tried to do was just say, all right, if we don't want a lot of lots to be below the minimum, we'll just cap the number of lots below the minimum. And if we don't want them to be so small, we'll just cap that too. And the overall effect will be the same. But we can certainly cut that pie many different ways.
Well, I appreciate moving with a sense of urgency on it. I actually thought about asking for a moratorium, but I mean, we're moving forward as rapidly as we can. I do want to comment on the little red thing that gets sent around everybody, unless you're prepared to investigate what that entails. So I'm hoping we use our new hire to actually maybe increase public awareness of what the actual subject matter is, because on its face, that little 3x5 card is the most vague of descriptions.
Mm-hmm. It's legal language.
Yeah, which, bewilders even the most educated.
But it does refer you to the city's website where all the rest of the information is available.
I don't disagree with that, Nancy, but I mean, you got to hit people between the eyes, because it's like, it's pretty superficial. You look at it and you throw it down. It's like, hey, here's what we're going to talk about, folks.
There's just too much information to try to.
It's scary.
I was just going to point out with this question about the PGE easement and these private sort of development restrictions. The problem with that is we've got an obligation to make clear and objective decisions with regard to housing. And I'm not sure that we want to be in the business of reviewing private easements and evaluating whether or not they're developable or not. That's why the code right now excludes developable areas as areas in tracts. Areas in tracts are really clear. You look at a plat, it's in a tract, it's not in a tract. It's really obvious. What the nuances of and limitations are of various private easements can be different across the board. And so you get into these judgment calls that I'm not really comfortable getting into. I mean, we can look at it, but that's my concern.
I agree. The less subjectiveness there is in the code, the better.
And quite honestly, the approach that Lauren's taking pretty much simplifies that. I don't disagree with it. I think we're going to get a pushback on that 10%, which you already are. But I think the goal is the same for all of us. We don't talk about transition areas, which we talked about before, and that's probably be another stumbling block about trying to transition from adjoining 8s to 6s to whatever.
This has got to go through the planning commission, right?
Yeah.
So yes, we could talk about process. Do you want to change these numbers? Are you okay with these numbers before we talk about process?
They could change through the process.
They could change the process. Do you want me to amend the draft that goes forward, or stick with this and see what happens?
I'm fine with this for right now.
I am too, but I need to sit down with you and go over so I understand it better.
Okay, I would love to.
Yeah, I'm fine with it as a starting point, and we'll see what the feedback is.
Okay, and then process. Carrie's going to talk to you a little bit about process. Up on the slide, we wrote a couple of dates. We have a planning commission work session scheduled January 22nd. We're going to have an open house before that, so the public can take a look at these code changes too. And then we anticipate hearings from planning commission in February. I don't know how many hearings it will take. And then city commission, I assumed 2. City commission I put in March. And then Carrie can talk to you a bit about it. Should you want to keep this in this code amendment process we are already doing for all these other code amendments, or appeal it apart through an emergency ordinance?
So I think that's the question of where we are right now. Right now Laura has got this on a track to, as she's outlined on the left-hand square, and that would be consistent with the Measure 56 notice. The blue card provides that we will have these hearings on February 12th. if there is a possibility of separating the lot averaging question from the larger code amendment packages and expediting it. I have some concerns about that. One, because that's not consistent with the notice that we mailed. Two, we've got some code provisions that require 1750-170 says that all legislative actions, which this would be, are to begin with a public hearing before the Planning Commission. And to separate these and
Let
have.
me just stop you here. I don't see any reason why we would need to push forward, separate this, make it an emergency.
I
Just-
agree.
You know, anytime we do that, we put ourselves in jeopardy of endless appeals. And frankly, I'm done with appeals. So,
And I understand that position. I'm curious, in the applications you've received that qualify to use lot averaging, how many are taking advantage of it currently?
Most.
Most being a number, 2, 3, 4?
90% have utilized it in some way, maybe not to the extreme, since we've adopted it in 2004.
So in a hard number, how many are using it to the extreme? Guesstimate. 2, 3, 20?
This seems to be the first year that this ever came up, and we've seen more subdivisions with a majority or a significant amount of lots that were below with these really large lots with the power line easements. We have seen that once or twice before, but this year we saw 2 of them, which started the conversation. So it's never really been a conversation before.
Would this, if we went through the usual process without the emergency, would this delay them greatly, or?
No, and
Just because they have to go through all of their land use process themselves.
so one of the concerns I have with doing the emergency ordinance is that people pay us to research their proposals before they apply. We require it, but it's a pre-application conference, so they say, here's my design, does it look good? And then we say yes, and they spend a lot of money after, we tell them, we review it with the code, and we say, here's the code sections we think you don't need, everything else looks fine, finish your proposal, put it together, turn it into us. And if we change it suddenly without giving a lot of notice to people in the queue, they're gonna have to change their designs. I'm worried for the people who have already had pre-app, who we haven't notified of a potential change when we move too quickly.
But
We speak about the moving goalpost.
Right. Yeah, I was just
You
gonna-
want to comment on that?
I was just going to say, so people can continue to submit applications under the code that's in place today. We will continue to process them. If they're in mid-process and we change the code, they're entitled to the code that they submitted under. So this won't delay anybody, or it won't. If someone's submitted, they're entitled to the code that they submitted on that day.
Yeah.
Even if we make 100% changes to the code,
Okay.
it does not apply to them.
It's just the fairness for letting people know if they had their pre-app meeting last month and this wasn't a thing. And then they turn it into me the day after we make the code change and we say, you're incomplete, start over.
But to be clear, if we put a moratorium on it as of that date, they couldn't process those applications.
I would hesitate
moratorium
greatly
comes
to
with a-
use the word moratorium.
A moratorium comes with a whole lot more
Let's-
than.
I'll choose whatever.
Let's say we did an emergency ordinance
Yeah.
that we put into effect immediately that said you can only do 10% lot averaging for 25% of the lots.
Yeah.
And we said it goes into effect immediately, then it would become effective immediately for those applications submitted after that date. If you're in, you're in.
I'm curious what the amount of support for that would be here.
The other thing that I would
No.
point out, the difference is about 2 months, if you look sort of at the choices. And we've had lot averaging in place since 2012,
Or
2004.
Sometimes in the course of human events, things get discovered that you can take to your best advantage, and I think that's a position we're in now. So I personally don't care if it was in effect since 1940. Recent events show me that people have discovered it, and it's like, wow, let's do this, because it maximizes.
But we also can't legislate based on, a group of people being angry about something that's happening in their neighborhood.
we have to look at the city as a whole, not just at one subdivision.
I don't disagree with that, Mayor.
Okay, well, I think we're getting a little twisted up about, a bunch of people coming and yelling at us when, and we're trying to find a reasonable accommodation to adjust that. And I think if we're going to try to find that reasonable accommodation, it needs to go through the regular process, the regular order. And I have a feeling that when it goes to the Planning Commission, it's not going to look anything like this when it comes to us.
Well, we'll find out.
Mm-hmm. So I would absolutely be opposed to any kind of an emergency ordinance at this point in time. I think it needs to go through the regular process.
Well, I think the reason we're seeing more of this lot averaging and more conversation about it is because the properties that are being developed now are rough properties. The gravy's gone, as far as developable properties that are flat and no issues and stuff. Now we're getting into the trees and the cliffs and everything else and the power lines and so now we're going to be experiencing this more, where the lot averaging is got to be looked at.
Is there anything else on this?
Yep, so just real quick, I'm going to spend 5 minutes, no more, finishing this. So other significant changes are we remove the reconsideration process. The reconsideration process is currently in our code where 10 days after we issued a decision, anybody could say, are you sure, staff? We think you miscalculated something, and then we can come up with another decision. We were proposed to remove it because we have an appeal process, and it's confusing when you do both at once. We already have a process to address errors, and we'll do our best to not make any. The second one is we put in a requirement to allow a minimum parking reduction of 10% on a fixed transit route. This was in our code before, and it got taken out when we made a bunch of other changes to parking reductions, and we thought we had left it in there, but we didn't. And then we made an amendment to allow demolition of any size structure over the counter. When we did those type 1 site plan design review, we said additions or demolitions of X% can go over the counter. And so we wanted to remove that barrier to allow demolitions of any size to be reviewed over the counter.
Now, I assume that the designated historic structures would still have some sort of review process as far as demolition is concerned?
Yeah, you'll still have to go through any overlay district reviews that you need to.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And then lastly is there are some restrictions. Our code doesn't exactly match case law for wireless communications facilities. In other words, you can make minor amendments with less of a process than our code requires, so we wanted to sync that up. Here's a list of other changes. It's clarifying language. We added definition. We specify things with more clarity than we have in our code today. We streamlined certifications for landscape architects. So if you're doing a commercial property and you're just doing some amendments to landscaping less than 500 square feet, you don't have to hire a landscape architect. You can get other type of certified professionals to verify that landscaping is correct. We've done a lot of research with the Landscape Architects Institute, another thing like that. And it's very hard and costly to hire landscape architects. So if you're just planting a couple of shrubs and some ground cover, you should be fine with other certifications. We also amended our definition for child care facilities. The state ORS says that you can have 16 children that you can care for at a single-family home with a child care facility. Our code said 13, so we amended it to match state law.
I have a question on that one. Mm-hmm. Are you done?
So do I.
So the family daycare, 13 versus 16. So does that mean that you could have, 25 children on your rolls, but only 16 or 13, as it is today, 16 at one time? Because that makes a big difference. I mean, I know that they did say something about it, that the ORS says regardless of full or part-time But is that what that means? So we should probably make that clear in our code too, because when I read it, I'm like, well, you know, if I wanted to have 25 kids on my rolls, I would just be limited to 16 at a time and do some fancy scheduling.
Okay.
Yeah, I was curious why we were getting into the business of daycare, but I see you're just trying to bring it in compliance with the state.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, does the state also controls ratios of people to children and ages? And
They do.
So are these all
have to be
licensed
licensed.
daycares, or what about these people that may or may not be licensed?
Yeah, so ideally, everybody is licensed. We see these, we administer this code language when someone submits a business license, and we'll ask them with more clarity how many kids that they have enrolled at the daycare. And then our business license people are so great. They also make sure that all the applicable jurisdictions and authorities sign off on those business licenses, so they'll get state sign off and things like that, and code enforcement, and you name it. So we all check the box before business licenses are issued, but we use business license as a tool in the zoning world to make sure that whatever the proposed business is complies with our regulations.
And just to respond to Commissioner Ike's question, I think that the state is the one that monitors how many people are enrolled and how many people are present and all of that stuff. We don't, I mean, we use the state law as the threshold for land use purposes for determining whether or not it's a daycare facility. So how many people are enrolled, I don't even think we would know. I mean, we would know what they filed the business license for, which is gonna be 13 kids or 16 kids. So that's, I think, all we know.
We ask them to clarify the number of kids before we sign off on the business license.
And so the state would control whether or not they, you know, they had 25 on their rolls or, okay.
Yeah, we don't look at their roles, we just trust them, and if there's a code enforcement case, we say,
Okay.
do you have 16 kids? And
Because we're not we're not establishing what's safe or what's appropriate or what kind of facilities you need. We're just using the state standard as a way for a land use regulation.
Okay.
So if they had like 50 kids, that might not be appropriate for residential zoning designation. And then the last thing that we changed is we changed our lighting code a little bit. We got a little specific there with what kind of bulb types that we want. And since then, things like LED exist, and so we removed that requirement. And then we had some redundant language that we got rid of. And that is it.
And I have one more comment on that lighting. So the Audubon Lights Out campaign, another one of their big things was to make sure, or to request that when you do code revisions, that you remember their requests. So is there anything more that we could do? I mean, I guess you'd have to read what they have to say about that, but is there more that we could do? I guess that's my question, you know, to comply with their requests.
You know what, that's a great question.
Not that we need to do that, you know, but.
Lighting has come up for the Natural Resources Committee as a significant issue in 2017. So we have spent a handful of meetings at NRC talking about night sky lighting and the same type of issues. And so we've had a lot of reports from Martin and other lighting specialists as to what our code is and how it applies to those environmental protection regulations. I'm sure that there may be something that we could do more. In our assessment, we actually have pretty good lighting standards as it relates to dark sky.
Okay.
Is that it?
That is, thank you.
Can I ask one question? These are, what? Is there something in our code that says, because we've got some maybe multi-floor buildings that might be in our future, is there anything in the code that says that if you're doing a BD, that if you're doing one of those buildings, a requirement for it's called a BDA, bidirectional amplifier. It basically, we had to have one put in the high school, and I know that some cities, and I think the county, if you have a building that has multiple floors, police and fire go into those buildings and their radios can't get out, and so you have to put this amplifier in. They're fairly expensive, and some cities have it as part of their code that has to be a condition of getting their certificate of occupancy. Do we have that in our code?
Not in our planning code. I'll check with the building official.
Because I think that's something that
I don't know if
we
it's in
should
our
have.
building code. It's certainly not in our planning. We just look at the exterior for the most part.
Questions? Okay.
Then we'll move on to communication, Mr. Manager.
I don't have any updates for the commission tonight.
Okay. Anybody have anything? Okay, then we're adjourned.
Thank you.